selector is what determines what gets the CSS rule. So really a CSS, whether it be an external CSS file or an embedded CSS data, is typically composed of everything really other than inline, but is composed of a selector and then a list of style rules. All right, a list of attribute and values that change the appearance of the page. The most basic way to select, we started out, is with HTML tags, and that allows us to define every HTML tag on a page to get a certain style. And we've seen a bunch of examples of that. If I can just find one. Oh, I would say, why is this in a folder called Lab 6? But it's because I was talking about how to turn in stuff for labs. Anyhow, Lab 6, we have this folder, and if we look at the photography page, and then we look at the CSS selectors, we'll see that some of the selectors are based on specific HTML tags. I'm going to get rid of that duplicate stuff just so we don't get confused. Get rid of this one. Then if we look at the CSS code, we'll see that all of these are selectors based on HTML. So every H1 tag gets this rule. Every H2 tag gets this rule, and so on down the line. All right. Again, we talked a little bit last time about what happens when there are multiple rules that apply to the same thing. And a general rule is the more specific the rule is defined takes precedence over less specific. And another way, another true statement is the closer that the CSS is to the element, it takes precedence. So an inline takes precedence over an external, and so on. All right, we can do a little bit of shorthand here. If we want H2s and H3s to have the same font, I can just separate them by commas. That way, I don't have to have a separate line for both. So that's one thing that you can do with selectors, is you can combine them that way. And the effect should be the same on the page. All right. So they have the same font. All right. So that's the one kind of selector, just the basic HTML tag. We talked about two other selectors that I want to talk about and I want to reinforce. All this is covered in the book starting on page 214, by the way. If you, in your reading, there's a nice little summary of this stuff. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is the use of IDs and classes. Here's an example of a style rule based on an ID. All right. Now, an ID, remember, should be unique. That is, there should only be one thing on the page that has an ID of special in this case. And if we look at our HTML document, sure enough, we'll see that this H3 is defined as special. All right? And therefore, if we look at it, it's styled differently than the other H3s. All right? Camera phone is another H3, and it's green and small. DSLR is red and a little bit bigger, so it's styled a little bit differently. Here's a case, again, where there are more than one style rules that apply to that element. All right? Because this element, this H3, that has an ID of special, all right, this style rule applies to it because it's an H3, and this style rule applies to it because it has an ID of special. So which style rule applies? Actually, I may have misspoke a little bit before. Actually, both style rules apply. All right. The real question is which takes precedence. In this case, if we look at that H3, we'll notice that this is a font family for it, and this is the color and size associated with it. So if the different style rules, if there's multiple style rules for the same element on the page, as long as they're not for the same attributes, then all of them apply. It gets some of the style from the H3 style rule. It gets some of the style from the ID style rule. If there's a conflict between them, then the more specific one wins. So for example, if I go in here and I were to say that my special class has a different font family, then the font family on the ID style rule takes precedence over the font family on the H3. All right? So that's sort of the cascading. It goes from the higher level down to the lower level, and the lower level takes precedence. By lower level, I mean more specific.
And the lower level is cascading inside the HTML file itself. That H3 ID special has to be after the rest of the preceding instructions for CSS.
Well, the CSS.
What I'm saying is that if you cut that right there and put it on top, right under the body, that would not take precedent.
Yeah, sure it would.
It would, still would.
Sure it would. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The position of an element within the HTML doesn't, for that particular question, no, it doesn't really matter. I could put that H3 anywhere in the body, and it would do that. All right. What I'm saying here about what takes precedence applies really for all the selectors. So whether you're talking about a class or an ID or whatever, that cascading works that way. An ID, again, ought to be unique. So there should not be two things on the page that have an ID of special. And there's some implications of this, especially when we get into like JavaScript, or if you get into JavaScript coding. An ID, you want to point to one specific thing. Your ID number doesn't point to you and 3 other students. All right, that wouldn't be workable. All right, so an ID in an HTML page ought to be the same. That a specific ID points to just one specific element. Now, class is something that can be shared among HTML elements. All right. Notice the difference when you specify an ID. You specify with a # before the selector. When you specify a class, you specify with a period before the selector. All right. And again, just like with the ID, you have to assign that ID to the HTML elements that you want. Nothing automatically has an ID of special, right? You have to go and you have to assign that to the particular element that you want that ID for. You have to do it with a class, except again, you use class equals instead of ID equals. Now, again, the thought with this is that something can share, or different elements can share the same class. If I talk about a class of students, like for example, students that live, let's say here's a class of students that live in Elyria. That's a class. right? That's a category or class of students. There could be more than one student that lives in Elyria. There's a bunch of students that live in Elyria. So a class can be shared among several elements of HTML. All right? So I can say this paragraph is less important, and I can say this paragraph is less important. All right? And that's not a problem. I shouldn't do that with IDs. I shouldn't make the IDs. Now you might say, well, I made multiple things on the page that had the same ID and it worked. Yeah, but that will cause you problems in the long run. So again, just because it works for your immediate needs doesn't mean that it is a strategy to pursue. All right? So, let's see. Questions about what we've talked about so far regarding this? It is possible to get your style rule from multiple tags or multiple selectors. There is containment, so if I specify a style on the body, if I don't override it with another style, then it'll get that style from the body. So again, it can get different pieces of its style from different selectors. That's why it's important to think about what you're doing first. One thing that you want to avoid sort of is like micromanaging your CSS code. In other words, coming up with a very long, involved, convoluted thing. Sometimes if you take a little bit of time to think through what you're doing, you can style things a little more effectively. And you'll make the win there is that you'll get code that's easier to maintain. One thing I would say is when you're thinking about like what IDs and what styles to create, don't think about the physical appearance. Think about why you want to tag that as something special. For example, these two paragraphs I've given a class of less important. All right? So I deem those two paragraphs as less important. All right? Notice I didn't say small font, right? Because I could show something being less important a couple of different ways. I could show it in smaller font. That's one way to visually indicate that something is less important. I could maybe push it off to the side. That's another way I could show something as less important. Likewise with special. I didn't say red H3. All right? Because I may later on decide not to make it red. And then I have a style rule that says red H3 and the H3 is actually blue. That would be very confusing. All right? So when you're thinking about creating these IDs and classes, think about why you want to treat this different. What is special about this? All right? So maybe this stuff is special because it's the header of the page. This is my information about selecting a camera, so I'm going to give it an ID of select. So my IDs and class names relate to the content and not how I'm planning on styling it. Because you can always change how you're going to plan, how you plan to style it, and you can always make it look different. All right. Another thing that you can do is you can style things based on the context in which it appears. All right? So let's look for an example of that. All right? I have a link up here, and I have a link down there. All right? So I have a link up here on the top of the page, and I have a link down here. I could say that links in the footer I want to make look different than links that are in, say, the nav section. So I could do something like this. I could say footer A, color black, font size let's make them really big so that we can see them. A lot of times when I style to demonstrate, I'll use like outrageous values for these just so it's apparent what I'm doing as opposed to like making it just a hair bigger. All right. So let's go and let's look at this. And we go and click refresh. Now notice that link looks different than that link. Why is it? Because our style rule says footer space A. And the way you read that is any links, any A tags that are in the footer get this style rule. All right? So again, it's a matter of cascading, right? This says any link on the page gets this. This says links in the footer get this rule. Obviously, a link in the footer, both those styles apply. So which one do we use? Well, again, it cascades. Because this is more specific of a selector. This takes precedence over this selector. So therefore, it gets a color of black and a font size of 2M, as opposed to a color of green and a font size of 1.1 M. See what? Oh, okay. There we go. Yeah. Yep. A lot bigger. Now, if I go and do this, for the font size, this will take precedence. But because I've not put a color on it, it will get the color from this style rule. All right? Because it's still a link. Both these selectors apply to that element on the page. Yes, it's a link. And yes, it's a link in the footer. So it gets both of them. So the question becomes, which takes precedence? And the one that takes precedence is the one that is more specific. So now, it gets the green color from this style rule, and it gets the large size from that style rule. So that's what's called context-based selectors. And these can be very effective because, again, what we're doing is we are selecting things to look different depending on where they appear on our page, which makes sense, right? Our links in our navigation section, we might want to look different than our links that just happen to appear in the body of our text. So for example, these links up here, we might want to give one style to, whereas the links that appear in the body of the page within an article, we might want to give another style to. So I could say something like, nav A, font size 3M, color red. Maybe this is how some of those really ugly web pages that you guys turned in for your bad examples of bad web design came about. Maybe they were just demonstration projects from a professor somewhere that got a little out of hand and ended up going live. So again, here those links look that way, right, because they're in the navigation section. These links look that way because they're not in the navigation section. And this link looks that way because it's a link that's in the footer. All right? If you think about it, it makes sense. You know, when you think of what we're going to do eventually with this, and how we break down our pages into chunks, into sections. Navigation, header, footer, article. All right? That it makes sense that a link that you have in the navigation, you might want to look different than a link that is going to be displayed elsewhere. You know, look at, let's just go to any old web page. Let's go to Amazon. Here are their navigation links that look one way. Here are their links in the body of the page that look another way. Or if we go to CNN. Here are the links in one section of their page, navigation. Here are links that's in the body of the page, or in the content section. I don't want to say body, because it's all the body. But see, navigation, the links have one look. Within the content area, the links have another look. And then if we go and Americans win Nobel Prize in Chemistry, there's a link over here. It looks different still. All right. And again, we can choose that with a fine degree of control because we can use all these different selectors. All right? And, think in terms of, do I want it to look different depending on the section? That's one thing. All right? I can specify some general rules for every link. All right? I can specify that every link is going to have a certain font or a certain font size. But then I can style that links in the header section is going to look one way. Links in the navigation section is going to look another way, and so on down the line. Then you sort of have the wild cards to say, well, look, if this one link is an oddball link, it's in the body of the page or it's in an article, but I want it to look different because for some reason that's a different link. All right? Maybe it's a spoiler link. Maybe it's a link to a page that says who's going to get voted off Dancing with the Stars. All right? So I want to indicate it's a spoiler a different way. All right? Maybe. All right? So I could do that, and I could style it. So that one link is going to look different. Now, if that is unique, and there's only going to be one like it on a page, I could say, give an ID to it. But like, for example, with spoilers, well, you could have a bunch of spoilers on there. Who's voted off that? Who's voted off Survivor? You can have a different spoiler, in which case you'd assign a class to it. All right? Other selectors. There are selectors for what are called pseudo classes. All right? What is a pseudo class? A pseudo class is this thing like this. Certain things that aren't really classes, that's why they're called pseudo classes, yet they're elements on the page, certain aspects of them. So for example, and just for demonstration, I'm going to get rid of these styles. Why does this link look different than these other links? It looks different because we have visited that link. All right? So we don't have anything in the HTML page that says that this link is visited, but the browser's smart enough to know that, hey, that's a pseudo class. If it's visited, display it this way. Now, we can do some nice little effects with this if we use the hover. So I could do something like this. One of the pseudo classes is hover. I'll make it gigantic. All right, so there's our link. Boom. We put our mouse over it. It gets really big. Now, obviously, that's maybe a little bit overkill, but that certainly does give a visual cue that you're on a link, right? Remember, going back to design, one of the things that we said is that a key to good design for a website is good navigation. Well, what is good navigation? Well, sort of the first rule is let people know what the links are, right? You know, if they can't tell that it's a link, it's going to be hard for them to use the navigation scheme. So that's why we can style links, and we can give them a different appearance. We can give them a different color, for example, and usually within context, people understand that. In addition, there's sort of the convention on the web that only links are underlined. All right, so it's probably a good idea not to underline any other text other than links, because by convention, links are underlined. So you can give that visual cue as well. Another way you can do it is by setting the hover state, the hover pseudo class in CSS, so that when the mouse is over a link, it somehow changes. Now, we can do much more subtle than that. We can almost get to the point where these start to look like little buttons, right? If we go crazy with this. We could, for example, give this a background of gray, let's say. On the hover, I'm going to do just the reverse. I'm going to make the color gray and the background green. So there's our links. Not particularly readable, but if we put our mouse on one of them, the colors switch. Let me go maybe make some more reasonable colors. Let's make a background of a color of white, a background of red, color of red, a background of white. All right. So, I'm going to get rid of this one for good measure. So you can almost, when we start adding things like borders to these, and space them out a little bit, and rearrange them, they start to actually kind of look like little buttons. And it's done entirely through CSS. All right? Which is great, because if we then decide at a later point to change it, we can change it. Now again, notice when we do that, all our links look like that. Well, maybe we just want those links in the navigation section to look like that, in which case we then go and we use the context to say, only links in the nav section am I going to make look kind of like buttons. All right? And then we could have other style rules for the other links. So those links look like regular, normal old links. These links have our special formatting on them. All right? So that's sort of the kind of thing that you want to do. But at any rate, this is called a pseudo class. All right? Because it's not really a class, but it's just sort of a characteristic or a behavior, more like it. One other thing that we could do in relaying a context is, let's see. I could do this. Let me move this. I might want to style an H3 that's less important, different than a paragraph that's less important. Yes? No, the pseudo classes are specific. They're things that the browser just knows. The most common ones relate to a link, to links. Like, for example, there's the There's active, there's linked, there's active, there's hover, and there's visited. All right. But there's others as well. Like, for example, there's a first letter pseudo class. So you could style the first letter different than other stuff. First line, yeah. Yeah, I think so. All right. So let's say here in this, go ahead. Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. There's a specific order that you put them in so that it gets the optimized behavior, the pseudo classes for links. In this case, let's say I want to make H3s that are less important different than paragraphs that are less important. I can do this, and this is another example of context. I could say everything that's less important gets that style. And it would look like this. All right. Or I could say H3s that are less important has one font size. Paragraphs that are less important have a different font size. All right. So they're the H3. Even though they both have the same class, they look different because I use context-based selectors to say that H3s that have a class of less important look different than paragraphs. Now I could do the same thing with ID, except that's sort of a waste. Why do I say that? So for example, here I have that one thing that's special. Where is it? Oh, H3 special. I could do H3 pound special. All right. But I just said a second ago that's kind of a waste. Why do I say that that's kind of a waste? Yeah, because IDs are unique anyhow. In other words, if I put the special tag on an H3, that's the only thing that's going to have that ID. If I put the special ID, rather, not tag. If I put the special ID on an H3, that's the only thing that's going to have that. So I might as well just do that. I don't know. With classes, it makes more sense than with IDs for me. But it works for IDs as well. Let's see. You can also give style rules if a element has an attribute. On our list? Absolutely. You can do a style list for any HTML element. One thing you can do is Another way you can do a link within a page is create an A tag with a name instead of using an ID. Keep in mind this is just to demonstrate the concept. All right. What that style rule says is any link, any A tag that has a name attribute gets this rule. Doesn't matter what the name attribute is, any link that has a name attribute. So this link has a name attribute, so it gets that style. The other links do not have an A attribute, therefore they don't get those styles. Now, a few things to keep in mind as you're doing this. First of all, there's a bunch of ways that you could achieve the same look. All right, so don't think that there are any absolutely right and absolutely wrong answers. All right, there's many ways that you could achieve the same thing. All right, what would make one solution better than another then? All right, there can be more than one way to do things, but we can still look and say maybe one way is better than another way. Yeah.
Whichever approach is easier to make.
Yeah, whatever approach is simpler, and by simpler I mean easier to maintain. So this is a case of what do they call Occam's razor? You know, something that is a simpler explanation or a simpler way of doing things is usually better than a more complicated way of doing things. Even keeping that in mind, there could be two ways that are equally simple to maintain, in which case it really doesn't matter. All right? So there are very few absolutely right and wrong answers as far as how to style the page. A lot of it deals with organizing it. But I won't say that every solution is equal. Right? You can go the long way around, or you can take a more short, direct route to get the page the way that you want it to look like. You know, the simpler it is, the better it is. The more, and by simpler, excuse me, I mean more easy to maintain. Now, this will happen largely if you plan and you work and you refine it. All right. Very few people are so talented that they could just sit down with a page and just boom, bang out the stylings, any more than someone could sit down and just off the top of their head write a perfect term paper. Right. What usually happens in those things is you take a shot at it, you know, you think about it, you do a little bit of planning, and you say, well, let's see, I want to have these three main sections. Where do you get that idea from? From the wireframe that you drew, that you have these different sections. Okay, I'm going to have these sections, and the links in this section, I want to look a certain way, the links in this section. And you think all that through, and you plan it out, and you develop CSS. Then you look back and revise. You know, is there any way I can make this simpler? Is there any way that I can revise this to make it so it isn't quite so difficult to change? All right. Even give yourself little exercises. What if I wanted to change it to look this way? What would I have to do? And you can go in and you could see. And if the answer is, all I have to do is change a couple of things here, great. If it is, well, I have to change 20 things, well, then it's probably not as well thought out as it could be. All right. So spend some time planning, and then look at it and refine it, and try to make it better and better and better. All right. There are a few absolute rights and wrongs, like I said, but again, that doesn't mean that all solutions are equal. That you can a solution that's easier to maintain is going to be better than a solution that's harder to maintain. Questions about this area and selectors? Here's the idea as far as transforming your design into an actual website. All right? The process that you're going to go through. All right? The design document that we specified involves you thinking through the goals, thinking through the requirements, thinking how many pages you're going to have and how they're going to be structured. Then you come up with a wireframe. After the wireframe, you're to design sort of a prototype. That is sort of a working model of your web page. All right? So what you're going to do is you're going to take your wireframe that's going to look like this, maybe. And you're going to try to build a template for this. Oh, it's up there. All right. You're going to try to build a template for that. What do I mean for a template? All right. You're going to build an HTML file and a CSS file that together implement this basic look and has the appropriate colors and fonts and all that stuff that you want to have. All right? When you do that, after you are done, you're going to go and you're going to then clone that template for every one of your pages. All right? So making a 10-page website isn't 10 times longer than making a 1-page website. All right? Because you're going to make a template for those pages that's going to contain all the common code that's going to be on every page, and you're going to design a CSS file for it. That's making the first page. That'll take up a fair amount of time. Then going in and copying that page and making each specific page, that only takes a portion of the time. So really, it's not like it's 10 times as long to make a 10-page site than a 1-page site, if you really do it right. Because, again, you're going to make one page that's going to be your model, and then you're going to copy that. If you happen to have 2 wireframes, you'll make 2 templates. All right, one to implement the one wireframe, one to implement the other. And then you'll go and you'll clone that. Now, so far, we've just gone over some basic CSS stylings. All right? Remember, CSS, all CSS is a combination of our selector and then a bunch of style rules. Believe it or not, that says selector. And then a bunch of style rules. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about this, the stuff that you put in there. Mainly, we've used color and size and fonts. All right, that's the main things that we've been doing. And that was enough to demonstrate. All right. Now that we've gone over most of the possibilities relating to selector, our next job is going to be to really drill down in this area and look at all the things that we can change. All right? And again, remember, the question was asked is, can I style a list? Absolutely. You can style any element on the page. What can you style about it? Just about any quality that you could describe. The space between the letters you can style. All right? The space between this and the thing next to it you can style. Whether there's a border around something you can style. So what we're really going to do in upcoming classes is drill down and talk about styling this stuff. Now, the next chapter I believe is more on styling text, and we'll probably fly through that fairly quickly. All right? A big upcoming chapter will be styling positions. All right? Because so far, our web pages have looked like this. And we can do a lot with color, and we can do a lot with other stuff, but until we talk about using CSS for positioning, all our pages are going to look like this. All right? So the next really big important chapter is going to be, how can we organize our page so the header looks like this, and the navigation maybe is positioned here. And the content is over here, and the footer is here. In other words, maybe a more realistic look for these web pages instead of just a very linear model. All right? That linear model, again, we're not giving the user a lot of visual cues about where the sections of the page are. It just sort of runs together. By being able to position these things, we can help the user organize the content on our page and see what the different sections are. So that will be a big task of ours next week. I believe that will be next week at any rate. When we get through that, then, we'll go through the exercise of creating a template, a simple template for a page, and then cloning that template to create all the pages for a small example site. All right, questions? See you up in lab.